This is a chance for us to have an academic, a focused discussion of U.S. China relations in the midst of global uncertainty. And so we're delighted, again, to have you with us. Now, on the question of uncertainty, we know that there's uncertainty about climate change, there's uncertainty about economic conditions, there's a great many places in the world where there's actual military conflict, and these are big, big issues. And we want to talk about those issues and their connection to U.S.-China relations. U.S.-China relations might be, because of the troubled times that we're in, a source of some of that uncertainty. The United States and China, of course, are responsible for better than a third of the global economy, global GDP. We are also responsible for more than 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. So we are doing more than our share to change the climate. And the two countries combined spend about half of what the entire world spends on defense-related spending. So our impact is out of proportion. We have a disproportionate impact on the world. And so what happens in the U.S.-China relations is truly all important. I want to give a shout out to a group that we have here today from Australia. We have a delegation from Australia with officials from the Home Office, from the Department of Defense, Department of Foreign Affairs, and these sorts of things. And they happen to be visiting the United States as guests of the U.S. State Department to look into, among other things, U.S.-China relations. And so we're delighted that they are with us today. Because, of course, U.S.-China relations has a lot of connection to third parties, near and far. So we are extremely, extremely excited about today's discussion. And the way we'll proceed is that we'll invite Ambassador Zhang and Ambassador Bader to begin with a few comments of their own, 5 minutes or so of their own comments. And then we'll go to questions that initially I'll ask, but you have the ability to ask questions too. When you signed in today, you were given a 3x5 card, index card, and if you have a question that you'd like us to ask, please write it as neatly as you can. I'm old and my eyes are older still. So write it as neatly as you can and be as concise as you can. You will increase your odds of it being asked by doing that. And then pass those cards to the aisle and my colleagues will come around and collect them. And you can wait. We're not going to get to these questions for some time, so just listen for a little bit. Now again, for today's conversation, we have two of the most experienced people in this field, in U.S.-China relations. Ambassador Zhang is the Consul General representing the People's Republic of China here in Los Angeles. He has been in the diplomatic service for more than 30 years. He has focused on North America. He's held several posts in the Department of North American and Oceanic Affairs, but he's also served elsewhere, in Vietnam, in Australia, as it happens, as well as being the ambassador to Fiji. He's also played a role working as the leader, as the vice president of the Chinese People's Institute for Foreign Affairs. And so we're delighted to have Ambassador Zhang with us. We also have Ambassador Jeffrey Bader. And Jeffrey Bader is one of America's most distinguished China watchers, China hands. He has more than 3 decades of service in various government departments. In the Department of State, for example, he has served in diplomatic posts in Beijing, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, among other places. He has deep expertise as well in Africa and served as the ambassador to Namibia. His most recent most recent government service, however, was as the National Security Director for Asian affairs. And he did that at the beginning of the Obama administration. But he's also got this tremendous experience in the economic realm, because he was the assistant trade representative in 2001 and helped to negotiate China's entry that year into the World Trade Organization. So this is a truly distinguished panel. I want to recommend to you Ambassador Bader's book on his time in the Obama administration. It's a terrific resource. And he wrote it right after he left government service, while the memories were fresh and the details were clear. So I highly recommend that to you. So let's begin. Let's get into it. First with Ambassador Zhang.
Thank you very much, Professor Doobie, Ambassador Bader. Thank you very much, Professor, for your introduction. It gives me a great pleasure to join you and Ambassador Bader and to discuss current China-U.S. relations. And also it's a great pleasure to see friends from Australia. I used to work in Australia for almost 4 years, so nice to see you here. And Ambassador Bader, I think you are a very respected scholar and senior diplomat with deep understanding and rich experience in U.S. China relations. So I'm sure that I can learn a lot from your wisdom and experience. At present, U.S. China relations are standing at a very critical juncture to what direction this relationship is heading concerns many people who care about it. We have already heard many rational voices, such as the open letter signed by many scholars, including Ambassador Bader and Professor Doobie. So I appreciate your understanding of the importance of this relationship, and also wish to thank the USC, U.S. China Institute and China-U.S. Exchange Foundation for providing us with this platform to exchange views on current China-U.S. relations. So to start with, I would like to make a couple of points. First, on the global uncertainty. In China, we would like to say the world is going through profound changes unseen in its century. This, on one hand, refers to the changes in the international political and economic landscape as a result of the rise of emerging economies and the new round of industrial and technological revolution. So on the other hand, it refers to the various contradictions and challenges the world is facing with, which nudges us to a crossroads of conflicting solutions. Globalization versus anti-globalization, multilateralism versus unilateralism, integration versus isolation. So amid the global uncertainties and tensions, China has proposed its solution, that is to build a community with shared future for mankind. We firmly uphold globalization and multilateralism and advocate cooperation, openness, and win-win progress for common development. Second, China-U.S. relations are also going through some profound changes, facing with serious challenges. In face of the strong momentum of China's development, some people perceived it as a threat or challenge to the U.S. supremacy. So they are trying every means to depict China as a major adversary, clamoring for full decoupling with China or even the clashes of civilization. So we should guard against these attempts to lead China-U.S. relationship to a wrong direction. The U.S. side regards China as a primary strategic rival and has taken a series of erroneous actions in relations to Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, as well as on China's high-tech development and people-to-people exchange, which has caused serious setbacks to the relationship and adding risks of confrontation between two countries. What concerns us is that the current China-US relations is very much affected by what is called the paranoid style in American politics, which is highly politicized and ideologically biased. So under the prevailing atmosphere, playing tough on China seems to become the political correctness. National security becomes a convenient pretext for politicians to block any normal business dealings or personnel exchanges between the two countries. Rational voices for constructive dialogue and relationship are suppressed, and objective opinions on China are replaced by distorted rhetorics. So some people in the United States are intentionally stirring up ideological confrontation by attacking Chinese Communist Party and Chinese social system, which we believe has an ulterior motive. It poisons the atmosphere of the relationship, making it more antagonistic. Third, how shall we view the relationship and what direction shall we take our relationship to? China-US relations have achieved historical progress over the past 40 years since the establishment of diplomatic ties. The development of these relations have brought tremendous benefits to our people, contributing immensely to the peace, stability, and prosperity of the world. We should do whatever we can to maintain the good outcome of this relationship. China-US relations are built on common interests. Our interests are closely interconnected and intertwined, which means neither China nor the United States can move ahead without the other. To decouple China and the US is neither sensible nor realistic. Despite many differences, China and the United States still share lots of common interests, both bilaterally and globally. We should enhance cooperation in those areas where we have convergence of interests, and properly manage our differences to maintain a stable and healthy development of the relationship. We have been working hard to find solutions to the current trade friction. The latest round of China-US high-level trade consultation has produced positive outcome. This once again proves that so long as both sides demonstrate sincerity, take concerted efforts to address each other's core concerns, we can find solutions to any disputes. Fourth, China's development is unstoppable. The US side should accept this reality and find ways to coexist with China. China is committed to building a China-US relationship of non-confrontation, no conflict, mutual respect, and win-win outcome. We have no intention to scramble for supremacy with the United States, nor do we want to overturn the current international order and system, where China is also an active participant, facilitator, as well as an important contributor. China pursues a peaceful development path, and its development is solely for providing a better life for its people and achieving rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. The recently concluded fourth plenary session of the 19th CPC Central Committee has made an important decision to advance modernization of China's system and capacity for governance, which will provide a solid institutional foundation for the long-term development of China and realization of the two centennial goals. We stick to the path of socialism with Chinese characteristics. This is a path of Chinese people's own choosing and has been proven successful by history. We have no intention to transfer our own ideology and social system to other countries, nor do we want others to impose their ideology and value concept on us. The differences in ideology and social systems should not prevent us from working together. Finally, I'd like to add a few words on the issue of Hong Kong. The rampant violence that is going on in Hong Kong is a heinous crime which has nothing to do with democracy. When it comes to violence, everyone should condemn it. Any application of double standard is hypocritical. Ending violence and restoring order is the paramount task in Hong Kong at this moment. We firmly support Hong Kong SAR government and oppose any foreign interference in Hong Kong's internal affairs. We are committed to upholding the principle of one country, two systems and maintaining prosperity and stability of Hong Kong. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ambassador Zhang. And we'll be coming back to some of the themes that you've already highlighted. I failed in my introduction of Ambassador Bader to highlight his current job, which is Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. He was the founding director of the John Thornton China Center there some years ago, and he continues to serve that think tank.
Okay, so I've been involved in U.S. China relations for over 40 years. I first became involved when I was staff assistant to Richard Holbrooke when he was Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs in the 1970s, when we established relations with the People's Republic of China, working then for Secretary of State Vance and National Security Advisor Brzezinski. I have a long career of commitment to a positive relationship between U.S. and China. I got involved in China relations because I felt it was the most important issue for U.S. security in the 20th and 21st century. We were just emerging from the Vietnam War, where we'd lost over 50,000 Americans. We had recently fought the Korean War and lost over 50,000 Americans. It seemed like the problems in our relations with China were the principal cause of loss of American life in the world, and the opening by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger to China offered the possibility of changing that, and I wanted to be part of that. So that's what I've been doing for 40 years. Clearly, we're in a more difficult stage right now than we have been, in my opinion, since Richard Nixon went to China. Why is that? We'll get into a lot of that in the discussion. I would say there's a lot of responsibility to go around. There are realities, perceptions, and misperceptions that have brought us to the current state of affairs. I think from an American perspective, what has changed in the last few years that has caused the alteration in the view of China? And I would just cite four things, and then I'll wrap up and turn it over to Professor Dubey. The first is, compared to when I started working on China, China is just much, much stronger. It's a much more important actor in the world than it was for most of my career. China was a third world country, poor country, when I started, and through the 90s, and now, of course, it's the second biggest economy in the world. It's the largest trading partner of every country in Asia, and its military has developed a reach and resources to match its economic growth. So naturally, you're sitting in Washington, it looks like a different country than what you were looking at a few years ago. I'd say the second change is the trajectory of economic reform. Since 1978, when Deng Xiaoping presided over the third plenum of the Chinese Communist Party, China has been committed to restructuring of its economy away from the Maoist state-centered model towards a market-driven model. And that transformation got tremendous push under Vice Premier and then Premier Zhu Rongji at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, when I was working on WTO accession. They were both profoundly committed to that course. I think there has been there was, for some period after that, a certain drift in economic restructuring and reform in China under subsequent leadership. And I think in the last 5 or 6 years, it's the consensus of most Western observers that there has been backsliding, that the drive towards economic restructuring and reform and market-based change has been substituted for by emphasis on stability and party control and preserving a central role for the state-owned enterprise system. The third factor, the third item that I would highlight, this was just happening when I was leaving the administration, has been the developments in the South China Sea. First, the building of artificial islands, and followed by building of military facilities, runways, in some cases gigantic cities. Some of the photographs are quite amazing. That I think that was, I don't know, from China's perspective, these are all Chinese sovereign areas, but these are disputed areas, and suddenly to see substantial military capabilities extending this far from China's shores, I think was a bit of a shock to American observers as well as the other claimants in the area, and it raised larger questions about China's willingness to contemplate military confrontation. And I think the last factor that has altered views in the United States has been the reemergence of ideology in China. President Xi Jinping has emphasized study of Marxism, Leninism. Colleges are going back to school to be updated in their understanding of Chinese guiding philosophy. The party has strengthened its presence in enterprises, in universities, in civil society generally. And I agree with what Ambassador Zhang said about China not pursuing an ideologically driven foreign policy. That's something that some Americans would dispute. I do not dispute it. I agree with it. But the reemergence of ideology at home has altered the image of China in the United States. And if you combine it with the other three factors I mentioned, the backsliding and economic reform, a strengthened China, it's a different image of China than Americans had 10 years ago. These are things we all have to come to grips with, to the extent to which you agree that these are realities or perceptions or misperceptions we can discuss. But I think that these events and these views now dominate the American political discourse, not only in the Trump administration in a more intense form, but I think in both political parties they have affected views. So that's a challenge that we face going forward, those of us who care about this relationship.
Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, most of the students here are 18, 19, 20 years old. That means born in about 2001. And for you, it may be impossible to imagine that the Korean War was also a war between the United States and China. And so some reference was just made by both of our speakers to that. So in the early 1950s, we were killing each other. We were mobilizing against each other. And the next 2 decades, we had little contact, let alone productive interaction. But today, of course, there are millions of people who travel each year between our two countries. There are 400,000 students from the two countries, mostly the Chinese side in the United States, studying in two countries. We have over $500 billion in two-way trade, right? So there's a very, very different relationship. And so before we get into some of the things that definitely divide us, where we're really having some difficulties, I'd like for both of you, because your careers span the development of U.S. China relations, to reflect for a moment about what made that possible. What made it possible for us to go from hot war, Cold War foes to collaboration, partly driven by Cold War concerns, and now to this multi-threaded interaction that exists between our two countries, where we have scientific exchange, cultural exchange, all of this sort of thing. What has made that possible? What policies have made that possible? We may have two working mics now, I'm not sure.
Yes.
Well, based on my diplomatic career, I just want to respond to a professor's question. I think, generally speaking, the U.S. China policy has been struggling between ideological things and pragmatic things, I think, historically speaking. I think just now you mentioned the Korean War and Vietnam War. However, I think the cause of these two wars are all related to the so-called prevention, the spread of communism, right? So I think when I first came to the United States to work in New York, it was after the June 4th incident in Beijing. Of course, that
1989.
1989. And 1989 June 4th event, that's also somehow related to the sort of ideological thing involving U.S. and China relationship. So I think at that time when we were first there, the relationship was pretty strained. And nothing has happened. Not so much things has happened. But I think that had a sudden exchange, especially after Deng Xiaoping made the sudden tour remarks, which opened a new chapter for Chinese reform and open up. So I think that these kind of pragmatic approach has taken an upper hand in our foreign relation. So I think that's why we see a rapid change of the atmosphere in the relationship. So I think starting from '92, we see lots of American investments going into China and lots of business dealings between our two countries. So I think after that, there was a pretty long period of time there in which United States placed lots of hope on exploring and developing a Chinese market. So I think that's why you see the Chinese entry into WTO and lots of cooperation going on and joint ventures, and so I think that has built up the foundation, or that has consolidated, I should say, the foundation of the relationship. So that's why we said that the trade economic relations are the ballast stones of China-U.S. relationship. So I think. As I've said, I think China is a socialist country. I think we have said that we are going to stick to our own path because this is proven to be a correct path by history. So I think we are not going to change our system. However, we think we can still develop a very pragmatic, say, relationship with any other country, including the United States, based on common interests. So I think with that in line, we think this should be still the direction for the future relationship.
And so you just highlighted 1992, the Southern Tour. Ambassador Bader talked about the role of Zhu Rongji, the reforms, the entry into the World Trade Organization. So the economic side of it, but also the pragmatism. And Ambassador Bader, maybe you'd like to say something about engagement as a principle.
I think Ambassador Zhang was right to highlight Deng Xiaoping's role. I would go further. I think that the difference between the U.S. relationship in the 1960s and what we experienced from 1978 until recently was almost entirely due to Deng Xiaoping. What Deng Xiaoping did in 1978 and 1979 was that he decided that China's current economic model was a failure. So he basically took a sledgehammer to China's internal economic system. He decided that it could only achieve the kind of success that Chinese people expected and that would allow the party to remain in power if he opened up China to the world, meaning diplomatic relations with the United States, all manner of countries that China didn't have relations with before, that encouraged Chinese students to go abroad. That was a shock. No Chinese students didn't go abroad before 1978. A few of them went to Russia. That was about it.
Yeah, we had, at USC, we got our first 2 students from China in 1978.
Yeah, I mean, that was stunning at the time when Deng suddenly said 100,000 students, no problem. He encouraged overseas Chinese, many or most of whom had never been back to China, to come home to contribute to China's growth. He radically altered China's relations with Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea, all the countries in the region, because he wanted peace in the region and he wanted investment from these countries. It was just a series, an enormous series of dramatic changes that basically made China what it became. And from, this was 6 years after Nixon's visit. The Nixon-Mao opening was not about that. The Nixon-Mao opening was about strategic rivalry with the Soviet Union. Okay? But Deng transcended that and really opened the door for what China became.
And Deng was, at his core, a pragmatist. We've got to make this work. We've got to find a way. And so you highlighted this with the kind of incrementalism and these kinds of things. Now, one of the questions and one of the reasons why there's this economic tension is that economic reforms don't seem to be advancing in China in the way that they once did. And that Xi Jinping's focus on consolidating his authority and strengthening the party's role has gotten in the way of what was announced in 2013, all kinds of market-focused reforms. And so maybe we could say something more. Ambassador Bader has already spoken about this, and the Asia Society and other organizations that follow this very closely have concluded that in most respects, economic reform has not advanced. In a couple it has, but in many it has not. Has politics in the Xi Jinping era come to trump economics? Has ideology come to trump pragmatism?
I don't think so. I think if you look at the past, say, 40 years since the reform and open up, and we see rapid progress in reform, and we have established the market economy, and also private sector has also taken a very large percent of GDP, so most of the economic activities are conducted through the market. So and also we have built a very open, say, economic structure. And of course, China is a very big country, and as we said, it's pretty easy when you start reform, because there are lots of things that can be changed easily. And maybe after certain years, what's left are what we call hard bones, which are difficult, and because that kind of reforms need to be studied carefully, and in order to avoid, to minimize the sort of negative, impact on the livelihood of the people. So I think when we come across some of the difficult areas, obviously we need to have some time, to work out a program and find the right way, especially by learning the mistakes of other countries. So I think we are not doing the reform for the reform's sake. We try to make it effective, and also we try to pick up the right road. So after President Xi Jinping become the party secretary, and obviously you can also see the reform process have been accelerated also, particularly over the last several years. And look at what he has announced at the last year's Shanghai Import Expo, and also and also the Expo last week. And he has pointed out several outcomes of the reform. Some of the things are very difficult, and which I've been doing for quite a long time. So I don't think the reform process has been slowed down, or sort of ideological things has taken the upper hand. I think we are still pushing along the reform.
Ambassador Bader, could you respond to that? And certainly American exports to China until recently have been growing, especially the export of services and other goods, that sort of thing. And we have many American companies who make money within China. All of that is happening, but the business community and others are suggesting that China isn't moving in the direction of increasing market access in key sectors, and that in some sectors access has come too late to be meaningful. I was wondering if you'd like to respond to the question of whether or not reform is moving forward or backward. You've already said.
Well, I appreciate and understand the points that Ambassador Zhang made about the challenges of reform. You don't just take a blueprint and put it out there and then a year later announce you have a market economy. This is, as he says, an enormously complex country.
And Deng Xiaoping didn't swing the sledgehammer once.
Right. So I stipulate that I think that the framework Ambassador Zhang mentioned is, we always have to keep that in mind. China came pretty far. Right now, the GDP, something like 65% or so, comes from the private sector. So this is not the old-style Chinese economy. When you hear discussion of China in the United States and out of Washington, that makes it sound like sort of Brezhnev's Soviet Union. It's not. Okay, but when I was involved in the negotiations, I led the U.S. team on the final stages of the WTO accession. We had a lot of discussion among ourselves about what did this mean. Did it mean, we had the Deng Xiaoping experience and we had the Zhurongji experience. And our experience with China over the previous 25, 30 years had been that China needed a great man, needed a bulldozer for economic reform, because the forces of resistance and the stakeholders that had no interest in reform, who benefited from the current system, were so strong that unless you had someone like Deng or Zhu, who was willing to make enemies, and Zhu certainly made enemies. He was profoundly unpopular if you visited China at the time. You know that. Did the WTO accession change things? And was China now on an automatic path towards marketization? And there was quite an argument about that at the time. In my view, what's turned out to be the case is that you still do need the bulldozer. You still do need a great man. And in that sense, Xi Jinping, I think, has not played the same kind of role as Zhu Rongji and Deng did, which was a bit of a surprise to some of us who knew his background, son of Xi Zhongxun, and was a leading reformer in China and comrade in arms of Deng Xiaoping in the 1970s and 1980s. But we still have basically in many areas of the Chinese economy, if you're a foreign enterprise, you still need a joint venture. In order to operate in China, you can't have a wholly owned enterprise in many areas. The regulatory system is still, needs considerable work. It's still closely tied to producers, and of course, the courts are under the party. They are not independent of the party. So I've been involved with American companies that have had problems in China, and they've regarded them as fundamentally insoluble because the relationship between their joint venture partner, who was party approved, a local party secretary, and the courts. There was kind of an iron triangle there that the American joint venture partner simply could not crack. And the central role of the state-owned enterprises in many sectors has not been eroded as many Chinese economic reformers would like. The plan for China's economic reform was laid out some years ago by a study by the World Bank and this is the Development Reform Council of the State Council. Go back and read that. It was 2011, 12, something like that.
Yeah, it was yes, and it had the China 2030 in the title.
Yeah, I think Bob Zoellick may have been the president of the World Bank at the time, and there was Chinese. Bob Zoellick had the Chinese take the lead on it. It was not a World Bank imposed product. And that had go back and look at that. That's the direction that we all thought and hoped that China would be going. And my sense is that the current leadership is, I won't call them anti-reform. What I would say is that they are concerned about stability. They're concerned about national stability. They're concerned about corruption. They're concerned about party leadership. And that if those are your central concern, you're going to be uneasy about the disruptive effect that market-oriented reform brings. Market-oriented reform in the U.S. sounds like an easy thing. In China, it's destabilizing. It was destabilizing when Deng approved it, when Zhu approved it. So I think that the good news to me is that there is still a pretty healthy debate about these issues within China, among China's economic scholars, among China's economic actors. I can identify people who profoundly want to see reform push faster, but the forces on the other side are at least as strong and at the moment stronger.
And so you have these tensions because, of course, the government wants to maintain stability as also an avenue for continued economic advance, but you have massive inequality. You have frustration over rapid urbanization that has led to land seizures. There's a lot of issues at play, so we can appreciate those concerns that the government might have. And rooting out corruption, of course, has its own virtue, both in terms of improving governance and strengthening the link to the masses who support that sort of thing. Unfortunately, I have to be mindful of the clock, and so I'm going to push a little bit past the economic questions, although they're still there, because the next question involves the issue of decoupling, because the American national security strategy in place right now, put together by the Trump administration, argues that China is a major rival, and that China's strength has come from access to the dynamism of the American innovation economy. This is an exact quote. And that includes access to American universities. And that, of course, matters, certainly to us here at USC, where we have 6,200 students from China who are very much a part of the fabric of this community. And so what about this? What about this question of decoupling? And I would like for you to respond to that, because there are some people, especially those connected to the Trump administration, who argue that the only progress that's going to come in U.S. China relations is with dramatic American action.
My entire career, engagement was a central tool of American policy. I don't want to say that it was the American strategy. That is commonly said, and it's commonly wrong. Engagement is a tool. Okay, when engagement was put in place in the late 70s, what it meant was we were going to set up relationships across the board between American and Chinese counterparts. The American officials, American military, American academics, American law schools, American tourists, everything, across the board. And part of it was that each of those constituencies had common interests with the other side, and they also would provide a cushion for the relationship when it inevitably had difficulties. And that's the way it worked. So that's not a policy, that's kind of a safety net. It's a tool, okay? So when people say the policy of engagement has failed, I regard that as a wrong statement on every level. It's not a policy, and it hasn't failed, okay? But it's not sufficient for a policy. You need a policy. This is just a way of getting along. Look, I think that we have some Australians here. Instead of listening to me, what you ought to do is go out and read the most recent speech by Kevin Rudd. He gave a speech down the road at University of California in San Diego, La Jolla. I had dinner with Kevin a few days ago, and he knows China really, really, really well. Let me paraphrase him briefly. I shouldn't plagiarize, but what he said was better than what others have said. He talked about decoupling, and he said, writ large, it's ridiculous. Said, but he divided up the relationship into 4 or 5 areas. He said the economic relationship. You've got the trade relationship, you've got capital flows, you've got technology, you have student academic research. I think he may have had another, but basically highlighted those. And in essence, what he said was, I guess investment would have been the other. Okay? And basically what he said was, in the trade area, the notion of decoupling and disengagement is ridiculous. It's contrary to the interests of both sides. These are free decisions made by free partners on both sides. On investment, both sides are looking closely at what the national security implications are of certain kinds of investments. And so investment in both directions has tightened up recently, and that's going to require, same thing in Australia, it's going to require continuing scrutiny until we find the right place. So on capital flows, that's in the trillions of dollars, and the idea of putting a damper on that, and there are some proposals in Washington to do so, he again characterized as ridiculous, and I agree with him on that, and we can get more into that. Technology, he talks about at great length. He says that's the core problem. And how much coupling, decoupling do we want in the technology area? That's going to be the challenge going forward. And the people I speak to in the technology area, the cliche and the short answer is we're not going to decouple and we're not going to be completely embracing. It's going to be somewhere in between. It's going to have to be intelligent security and technology, economic judgments in each case. And the last area was research and academic, and on that he said, you Americans are in danger of going back to McCarthy, and on that, the idea of decoupling would be a tragedy and a disaster. And I agree with him on all five.
Thank you for that. We'd love to have Kevin Rudd here sometime as well. But the points are very clear. And tech is one of these areas where we have these obvious tensions. Access, the Chinese state media is able to access, for example, social media here in the United States quite freely. Social American companies are not accessible without special circumstances to Chinese citizens. There are major American tech companies that, for a variety of reasons, don't have access to the Chinese market. We have now the tensions over Huawei, and that has just been postponed. Those sanctions have just been postponed another 90 days. At the same time, the U.S. government is ordering wireless providers not to buy Huawei technology. And so we have a lot of these kinds of issues. Ambassador Zhang, I don't know if you'd like to say something about the tech side and innovation and the place that U.S. China tensions are occupy in that field.
Well, I think first of all, let me touch upon the decoupling. As I've said, because the interests between our two countries are very much intertwined, so we said that to make China-United States decouple is almost impossible. I think, especially in the era of globalization, where people have lots of communication. If let's say Chinese people cannot come to the United States, and then probably they will travel to other countries. So I think to maintain, as Ambassador Bader mentioned, I mean, the kind of engagement is always the right choice, and also that's the only choice for relationship between China and the United States. And also this relationship also brings tremendous benefits, right? Even for the economic and high-tech cooperation. I think in the case of high-tech, and actually I think these kind of exchanges and cooperation benefit both sides. And for instance, Huawei, they purchase lots of components from Qualcomm. I mean, that supports the development of that industry. And now suddenly, I mean, the U.S. administration stopped the supply, and then I think they are in trouble. And so I think we can. We are in a very globalized world. I think, especially for the high tech, I mean, it's hardly to say which part is yours and which part is mine. And also we need the concerted efforts to expand a new frontier. I mean, for the sake of human beings. I think already, I mean, there are lots of challenges, so we need to work out, together.
Yeah, I want to remind everyone, you have cards to ask questions, and if you have written your questions, please make sure they get to the aisle so that we can then have access to those. Thank you very much for this. We've got only a few more minutes, but we need to touch on so much more. Clearly, U.S.-China relations deserves a lot more than an hour. of course, one of the things that's very much in the news, and I think this is one of the reasons why American public opinion towards China has been sinking, right? And it's actually going in the direction of 1989. In February of 1989, 3/4 of Americans had a very positive view of China. They were excited by the reforms, the opening, all of those sorts of things. After the events of June 4th, the suppression of the pro-democracy movement, the student movement, that really hit public opinion hard. And it's never really recovered since then. But in recent years, it has fallen still further. And so now only 1 out of 3 Americans under age 30 has a positive view of China. And just a couple years ago, it was over 50%. Over 50%. Young Americans were especially impressed by China's rise. But we've had in recent years a lot of discussion about the human rights situation in China, including the arrest of lawyers defending Falun Gong members, lawyers defending women's rights activists, these kinds of things. So that's been in the news. And most recently, including this week, the revelations regarding the detention centers in Xinjiang. These are, of course, internal matters in China, but human rights is an international concern. And so it's natural that people would be concerned about the status of humans everywhere. And that's not to suggest that everything's perfect here in the United States. It clearly isn't. But many Americans have been focusing on this question. And it's one of the reasons why that opinion, especially among college-educated Americans, is at its lowest towards China. And I'd like to solicit the opinions from Ambassador Zhang and Ambassador Bader about this, about the role of human rights in how the two sides deal with each other.
Well, I think if you look at the websites, look at the video clips by lots of American students, and I think they feel very happy, and they also feel that the rapid development of China, they feel very secure, and also they also feel the atmosphere is very free. So I think on the whole, from these video clips, and they have very nice impression on China. Of course, the impression on China is very much, influenced by the Western media reports on China, which in most cases we think is pretty biased or intentionally biased. And especially when they talk about say issues like Xinjiang or some other things, I think they try to portray it as an issue of human rights. So I think that kind of media influence has played a role in their perception of China, and so that's why I think we need to present China in a very objective way, and also people have to look at China in also a very objective way. I think the Xinjiang issue is mainly about eradicating the root cause of extremism and terrorism. So I think it's not we provide some kind of vocational training for these people to learn certain skills, because we think the root cause of terrorism is related to their livelihood. If they have no skill, and then I think probably they will be sort of taken away by those kind of radical forces. So I think that's the starting point for for that education, right?
Okay, thank you. And the emphasis on economic solutions, providing greater economic opportunity, that also has come up in discussions regarding Hong Kong. And so it's a fairly common response to these questions.
When I was first involved in China was immediately after Mao's death, and China's human rights record was dismal in every possible way. And the livelihood of ordinary Chinese, I don't use the word totalitarian lightly, but that would be a fair description of the China that I encountered when I first became involved with China in the 1970s. Certainly, the China of today is very different in terms of the lives of ordinary people, in terms of ability to get a job of their choosing, go to school of their choosing, to travel internally and externally in all manner of ways. It's different China. It is, I think, a great disappointment that not so much that China has not become a fully democratized society or a pluralistic society in the manner of many other Asian countries. I mean, when I thought about China in the 1970s and 80s, contrary to current mythology, I never thought that China was going to become the United States. I don't know where that notion came from, but I think there was a common view among many of us that there was kind of an Asian model of development that we had seen around China's periphery. We'd seen it in Japan and Korea and in Taiwan and Southeast Asia. And I won't go through the details of it, but basically it's starting with export-led growth, working through rule of law towards anti-corruption, towards tolerance of dissent, and towards greater freedoms. Sometimes all the way to full multi-party democracy, sometimes not, but in any case, progress in that direction. I think it's been a great disappointment that, frankly, since 1989, China has halted movement in that direction. And it's not so much that those of us who care about China, care about the relationship, expect China to arrive at the final destination soon. We just want to see a direction. And that's what we don't see at the moment. The situation in Xinjiang, I think, is frankly intolerable. The notion that in order to deal with terrorism, and terrorism, Xinjiang-based terrorism is real. A lot of Chinese have been killed by extremists from Xinjiang. It's a reality. It's not made up. But the idea that the way to deal with it is by detaining against their will large numbers of people, and I won't throw a number out there, but you'll see numbers in the media, and their numbers are enormous, and that somewhere within these enormous numbers of people, there is a small number of people who may have extremist or terrorist leanings, and that you're going to wipe out the virus, but you're also going to ruin lives or effectively detain large numbers of ordinary people for a long period and subject them to re-education of various kinds. That is not something that would occur in a rule of law country. There would be challenges against it constantly, and that is just a gap in China. We don't really have much time to get into Hong Kong. I don't know if you want to talk about Hong Kong at all, Clay, or if that's a subject for another time.
Let's hold off on that for just one moment. About half of the questions that I received are about Hong Kong. So yeah, we need to do this. We are on the clock, so we do have to be mindful of that. But Ambassador Zhang, you made reference to the paranoid style of American politics, and one of the questions was, is it just automatic in America to be anti-China, especially in a political season? And so that question comes up. But one of the questions that I would like to ask you is whether or not there's a paranoid style in Chinese governance, that locking up these large numbers of people in order to stifle this danger represents fear and prejudice. Now, again, America has been there. We incarcerated Japanese and Japanese Americans based on nothing more than mistrust and suspicion. No evidence, locked them up and detained them. And this is not a mistake that we'd like to see China repeat. And so I was wondering if you think that the fear justifies the action.
Well, I should say that there's no forced detention in Xinjiang. I think we encourage people to receive some kind of a training, and just look at the fact that they can go back to their home during the weekend. It's just like a sort of a boarding school. So I think there's no ground to say that it's a sort of forced detention. So nothing to do with human rights, I think. And I think we emphasize on the rule of law. And if anyone violates the Chinese laws, and I think he or she will be dealt with. So that's no question. And also, but I think if I want to sort of argue with you by citing some of the examples here in the United States, and there are lots of say human rights violation cases, and also some of the Chinese nationals were detained simply, I don't know, on the reasons simply not true. Yeah, look at the Huawei's case.
Can we acknowledge that both of these things are wrong? That human rights violations in the United States are wrong.
But look at, I mean, well, if you go to China and ask people how they feel about the human rights situation, I think all of them, I think, will say that they are pretty happy with the rights they can enjoy. And I think especially the government now emphasize on the protection of human rights. I mean, we have put the protection of human rights into Constitution, and think now we have simply abolished lots of the old practices, such as forced dismantling of the houses. Yeah, I think these are sort of strictly prohibited right now because of the property rights, right? Yeah. So.
There are issues that are fairly intractable, and sometimes we may collide with those. Let's, because so many of you raised the question broadly of the situation in Hong Kong, many of you know, for example, that the United States Senate voted today to support the, if I can get the name right, Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. The House passed a version of this earlier. They need to reconcile it. So the American Congress is joining this discussion. But fundamentally, one question for us now is one country, two systems still operating? Is it functioning? Can it function under current conditions? And we'll have to ask both of you to be very quick and concise in your response.
Well, I think one country, two system operates very well and operates very successful. I think this is the only way for Hong Kong to maintain its stability and prosperity. And I think that the trouble is that those people that instigate sort of violence, yeah, are using some of the pretexts, yeah, at least I mean to challenge the bottom line of this one country, two system. So as we said, we'll continue to uphold this one country, two system, and we will maintain the stability and prosperity. Right now, I think they need to end violence, right? So it's a problem of violence.
Yeah, I think most Americans would concur on that.
I guess my answer is for the future of one country, two systems, I hope so. It's as designed, a good system. It worked well for a number of years. You all know the basic protections that Hong Kong has under one country, two systems, and they are real. Hong Kong residents live a different life than people across the border. But it would be better if Hong Kong moved. I mean, there are two fundamental problems. One, I think that Hong Kong needs to move towards having a responsible democratic government. And I think the blame for failure to do so falls on many, many shoulders. At the time of reversion, China clearly did not want to see a democratic government and made it clear to the last governor, Chris Patton, that that was not going to happen. But it did agree in the basic law to basically movement towards universal suffrage for election of the chief executive and direct election of all the legislators. And in 2014, there were proposals that would have, I think, made significant steps in that direction. And China and Xi Jinping approved those steps. And much to my chagrin, pro-democracy parties in Hong Kong in the Legislative Council vetoed them, basically on the grounds that they didn't go far enough. They didn't go all the way. And it was a classic case of making the best the enemy of the good. And it would have basically allowed for a competitive election for chief executive, although still chosen by the China-appointed commission. Well, a competitive election is better than a non-competitive election. Okay? So I think that was a missed opportunity. Both the Hong Kong government, the Chinese government, everyone involved has allowed a social and economic system to harden in China, in Hong Kong, that does not allow opportunities for young people such as were available 20, 30 years ago. And 20, 21-year-olds in Hong Kong can't afford housing, can't get a job. And this was, when I lived there 25 years ago, it was the most dynamic city in the world. And now you have young people who didn't know what to do. And they see erosion around the edges of one country, two system. They fear that Hong Kong will be completely absorbed. And they went out in the streets with vast support. And as Ambassador Zhang said, more recently, the movement has been taken over by people with no respect for the law and people who practice violence. It's an untenable situation, and it's frankly destroying Hong Kong. And I think that everyone is to blame, and everyone needs to step up to the table and put some compromises in play.
Go ahead.
I should say that, of course, in Hong Kong there are lots of social problems. I think especially young people feel the kind of, say, pressure. However, we don't think this should be the excuse for, say, engaging in street violence, especially by sabotaging public properties, setting fire on people. I mean, these kind of very hilarious things, I think that should be condemned. I think right now the trouble is that obviously there are sort of foreign interference which played a role to encourage these kind of violence, and confrontation with the government. And especially the media here, I mean, they simply focused on condemning the police rather than on the street violence. And also you mentioned the legislation in the U.S. Congress. I think this is not the only first time. And previously, Nancy Pelosi also said this is sort of a beautiful landscape, right? So I think this piece of legislation, Hong Kong Democracy and Human Rights Act, obviously, I think we have voiced strong opposition, and we think it will bring severe consequences. It's not helpful, to calm down the situation. On the contrary, it will encourage this kind of violence in Hong Kong.
Thank you very much. I know that all of you folks that are here, you want more. You want much, much more. And Ambassador Bader just mentioned that there's plenty of blame to go around for problems in Hong Kong. Blame on the government side, blame in civic institutions, business leaders, a lot of blame to be spread about. But I would like to highlight credit. I would like to credit not just smart leaders and not just start pragmatic policies, but also individuals. And I think that you folks are part of that mix. You are engaged in this discussion of U.S. China relations. This is far too important to leave to just the people in Beijing and Washington. And so I want to congratulate you all on coming, and I'd like to ask, I'm going to limit them to 30 seconds each, if either or both of our guests today would like to say something about the role of civic organizations, the role of individuals in U.S.-China relations.
Oh, absolutely, Clay. I mean, whenever I had congressional delegations going to China, when I was at the NSC in the state, I would tell them, spend as little time as possible in official meetings, go out outside of the government buildings, meet ordinary people, get out of Beijing. You will be enormously impressed by what you see and by the people you meet. And the government meetings, you can just pick up the newspaper and read what you're going to hear there.
Ambassador Zhang is a real practitioner of getting out and about. He goes across not just this community, but the region that he covers is very large. So he's very active in meeting with folks. But what about the role of ordinary people?
Well, I think it's important that we take a very fair and objective view on everything that's happening, to look at the things on its own merit. Just put aside these kind of ideological sort of, bias. So I think that could give you a very objective opinion. And then I think that will give you a correct judgment.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks to all of you. I hope that you will join us in thanking our two distinguished guests, first for their service to this cause of improving U.S.-China relations over decades, and second, for sharing some of their experience and expertise with us today. Please thank them.